evening, everyone. Welcome again to reading the Gospel of Mark again from the Jesuit Institute in South Africa. I am Fr David, and this is our sixth session of moving very slowly through the Gospel of Mark. I remind you that at the end of each presentation, there is time to pose questions, make remarks, which we ask you to put into the chat box. So if you could type them in, and then Ursula at the end of our presentation will help me answer those queries, or we would hear your remarks. So as always, we begin this time of Passion Week as we're preparing for Easter with our prayer, Taizé, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And so here we are together again. Welcome again to everyone. We are reading Mark and his book of the Gospel. So I repeat what I've said each week. This is a carefully composed first century Greek language, literary, spiritual, and theological text, inspired by the scriptures of Israel, as we've seen each time. Based, of course, upon the life of Jesus of Nazareth, the one we want to get to know more intimately. following, in my opinion, the writings of Paul of Tarsus. Most exegetes agree this is the first of the books of the Gospel and a source for the other books. And here we are. We've done the title, we've done the opening, we've done the introduction, and we are right in the midst of that first day of power, of authority, of glory. Jesus appears as a victorious hero. I mentioned last week, and some people wrote to me that they were a little surprised, that this first day has military overtones. Jesus calling the disciples, those fishermen, remind us from the scriptures of Israel that we are entering into an eschatological battlefield. Yes, that is not the tranquil, peaceful idea that we might have of preaching the gospel, but I think that it's important to realize that for Mark, this is indeed the beginning of a battle that will take us all the way to the cross. So, keeping that in mind, let us now go to the text that we're going to be studying tonight. And indeed, it is the first battle after Jesus has assembled a little army, his first 4 disciples, those fishermen that we encountered last week. So this is the text for tonight. They went to Capernaum, and immediately when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then, or immediately, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Immediately, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Again, a beautiful icon from the Byzantine tradition of that demon coming out of this possessed man because of Jesus's authority. Let us now go slowly through the elements of this text. I think as we focus more clearly on each detail, we come to understand with greater depth who Jesus is. And I want to start with the day of the Sabbath. Let us remember again, within this context of an eschatological battle, that our first Jesus, and you will remember or learn tonight that Jesus in Hebrew is Joshua, so that Joshua, that biblical military hero, has the same name as our hero Jesus. We all remember that great battle at Jericho. And let us remember that the actual battle took place on the 7th day. Yes, indeed, a Sabbath day for an eschatological battle. On the 7th day, they rose early at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you this city." The Sabbath. We think of it as a day of rest, but until the world is completely at rest, it is also a day to struggle, for the human being to be in the image and likeness of God. The Sabbath features prominently in this book of Mark. Let's just run through briefly the different Sabbaths that we are going to encounter here in Capernaum. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, the text that we are studying this evening. And then, in the next chapter, a completely different context we will soon see. It begins one Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields. And then the very next text, they watched him to see whether he would cure the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath. And then, when Jesus comes to Nazareth in chapter 6, there too a struggle, a battle. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. And at the end, right the last chapter, when the Sabbath was over. We notice here the importance of the Sabbath again. We must remember Jesus, a Jew, Jesus preaching to Jews, Jesus living within a Jewish milieu, the importance of that Sabbath day when creation is crowned with the human person doing what God does, making a Sabbath. It is therein that he reaches the fullness of the image and likeness of God. That is surely what the Sabbath means. And therefore it's no surprise that in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, when the transfiguration is described, the text begins 6 days later, meaning the 7th day. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. We'll be dealing with that text one day in the future, hopefully not in 2 years' time at the pace that we're going, but surely we will arrive. The next element in the text that I'd like to look at is Capernaum. Capernaum is an important place in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Indeed, they have come here to Capernaum, the scene for the first battle. As we read, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. For those of you who have been to the Holy Land, you will remember that Capernaum is a town on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee, or, I'll be more precise, the northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee. We remember last week, that we talked a lot about the Sea of Galilee being a border. And Capernaum is a town right on that border, a border between the land of the Jews and the land of the Gentiles. In chapter 2, right at the beginning, Jesus returns to Capernaum after some days, and it was reported that he was at home. And much later in the text, in chapter 9, then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, and so the text continues. It's interesting that Matthew, as we've stated more than once, Matthew is strongly reliant on Mark's gospel. He adds a biblical background to this town of Capernaum. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, it says in chapter 4, now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea. And then Matthew adds, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Notice its borderline placement. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. A quotation, of course, from Isaiah chapter 8. So, Sabbath, Capernaum. But there is an even more precise location in Capernaum, and that is the synagogue. Now, a word about synagogues in the life of Jesus. We are not sure what exactly a synagogue was at that time. Probably a meeting place, a place where the community gathered, particularly on the Sabbath, and studied the law. Let us pay attention, though. The synagogue is not yet what it is today. Today, Jews gather in the synagogue to pray. That is not a feature of the synagogue in the time of Jesus. It never says Jesus went to the synagogue to pray. He goes to be with the community. And of course, he goes to teach, as we have in this text. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. Later, he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. And in the beginning of chapter 3, again he entered the synagogue. There too it is a Sabbath. In 5:22, then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet. And then in 6:2, the last time we have mention of Jesus coming to a synagogue, on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. That is the synagogue, which in the text of Mark is placed in the town of Nazareth. But I do want to focus on another aspect of this word. Again, it's an aspect of the word that is only evident when we look at the word in Greek. What does synagogue mean? It is from the verb synago, which means to gather. And I think it's very important to realize that for any hearer of Mark's gospel, or as Mark writes the gospel, each time he writes the word synagogue, it will be connected to the verb to gather. And something very interesting happens when we trace synago, to gather, through the Gospel of Mark. Let's read one by one these examples of the word synago. In the beginning of chapter 2, so many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. This is the introduction to the man, the paralytic, who is let down from the roof. Notice, they gathered around. In 4:1, the chapter of the many parables, Jesus' discourse on parables, again he began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. In 5:21, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, he's come from Gentile land to Jew land. A great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Or in 6:30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And our final example at the beginning of chapter 7, now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him. What is my point in reading these verses with the verb synago, gather? It is to draw attention to the fact that in Mark's writing, Jesus has become the place of gathering. In a certain sense, Jesus has become a living, breathing synagogue as people gather around him to hear his teaching, to listen to him. The next word that I want to look at that is very, very important is the word to teach, or teaching as a noun. Twice we have an intensity of usage in the text near the beginning and near the end. Let's read those two verses again in the text that we're studying. After describing that he comes to Capernaum on the Sabbath and goes to the synagogue, 122, verse 22 in chapter 1, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Or in 127, near the end of our text, the second last verse, they were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Please notice the importance of this activity of Jesus. He teaches. We'll look at that in greater detail, but let's look at other places in the gospel where Mark insists on this particular activity of Jesus the teacher. At the beginning of chapter 4, once again, I repeat, this is the great sermon of parables in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. And there it is written in verse 2, he began to teach them many things in parables, and in his teaching he said to them. Or in chapter 6, again, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Yes, in becoming apostles, they do what Jesus does, and this central activity of teaching. And then much later, in chapter 11, Jesus is already in Jerusalem. And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. So first and foremost, we want to notice how important this activity is for Jesus, to teach, to come and teach the people. But I'm going to make a connection here again to the whole idea of battle, this eschatological battle and an eschatological teaching. Again, we look at teaching for battle. Let's read it now and focus on another word that is very, very important in the text. The word that repeats itself twice. Notice, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. We want to look at that word authority, and it repeats itself in the closing section of the text. They were all amazed and they kept on asking one another, what is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Firstly, let us look at this very verb in the same form as it appears in 3 texts in the Old Testament that kind of repeat themselves, almost a refrain that runs through a certain part of the Old Testament, I believe very much in the mind of Mark, as he describes Jesus not only as a teacher, but as teaching to do battle. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 35, it says, he is teaching my hands for war. In Psalm 18, verse 34, he is teaching my hands for war. And in Psalm 144, at the beginning of the psalm, blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war. Indeed, we see here this emphasis on a battle and Jesus teaching to prepare those who are willing to accept his teaching to do battle for God. Now, a focus on the word authority. This is a word that will be very important in this text and in some of the texts that are coming. Authority. And an Old Testament text that I would argue is certainly in the mind of Mark. Mark knows this text from Daniel because he will use a lot of the vocabulary that we find here in his description of Jesus. And so I read from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, the night vision. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being. I would say that we should be aware is I saw one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given authority, exousia, the same word that Mark uses, and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Who is this Son of Man? Or in the inclusive language of the New Revised Standard Version, one like a human being. I would argue that this is the new Adam. The first Adam was given exousia, was given authority, and handed over that authority to the snake. This is the second Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven, coming before the Ancient One, God, and receiving again the exousia, the authority, together with glory and kingship, so that this Son of Man, this one like a human being, is indeed a vice-regent on earth, ruling under the direct direction of God. So again, very important, this usage. We will see it will repeat itself in some of the texts that are coming up. And one more word that again gives us the idea of a battle and a military commander. For it is written, they were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, what is this, a new teaching with authority? And it's the word command. He commands, epitasso, even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Again, it's interesting to note how coherent Mark is, how careful he is in his choice of words, when twice in chapter 6, he will use this word, but there it will be a word used in order to distinguish between two types of commanders. In 627, the context is John the Baptist being beheaded. So in 626, immediately the king was sending a soldier of the guard with him. Okay, sorry, let me read that again. Immediately the king sending a soldier of the guard, he commanded to bring John's head. The same word, command. Jesus commands even the unclean spirits. Here the king commands those under his command to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison. And a few verses later, and the context here is the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. It's written, then he, Jesus, commanded them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. Jesus is commanding his disciples. And ordering them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass so that he can feed them. Here, a clear distinction between the kings of this world that command and bring destruction, and our commander who commands to bring life. In fact, this same verb will be transformed into a noun in Luke and used 6 times to describe Jesus as the epistates, Lord, our supreme commander. I'm sure some of you are making the connections with the spiritual exercises, and I won't say more about that. But of course, yes, I think that that is an interesting meditation on Jesus as our Lord, the one who stands over us. Now, let's move now to the center of the text. In order to move to the center, perhaps we should go back and look again at our initial text. I'm going to read from verse 23. Immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. Indeed, Jesus has come to do battle with Baal-Zebul. We'll get that word in chapter 3. Baal-Zebul means the master of this house. He has come in the name of the master of heaven and earth to do battle with the master of this house, who we've already met under the name of Satan. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Now that title is a very powerful title, proclaimed by a demon who knows who Jesus is. And it resonates, of course, with the Old Testament in Psalm 71. I will praise you with the harp for your faithfulness, O my God. I will sing praises to you with the lyre, O Holy One of Israel. Now this should come as a shock. The impure spirits in the Gospel of Mark know exactly who Jesus is. He has come to do battle, and the enemy knows him. This is underlined in the first chapters of the Gospel. Here in 124, this evil spirit says, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Or in chapter 3, verse 11, the spirits cry out, you are the Son of God. Or in chapter 5, verse 7, and there we have a parallel with the text we're reading. There it is a Gentile. You'll remember his name. My name is Legion, on the other side of the sea in the land of the Gentiles. And there, that legion of evil spirits cries out, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? This is shocking. The impure spirits know him, whereas those human beings who encounter him really have a struggle to know who he is. And what is the reaction of Jesus? And again, it's a surprise, a surprising reaction. Verse 25, Jesus rebuked him, saying, be silent and come out of him. And of course, the spirit obeys because of Jesus' authority. But what is the meaning of this be silent? Be silent? This will repeat itself many times in the Gospel of Mark, that as Jesus reveals his authority, shows who he is, he says, be silent. Many have talked about a secrecy in the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus wants the secret, the messianic secret, to be kept. I'm not a great fan of that theory. I think something else is going on. And let's talk about that for a moment. Is there a messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark? And what is going on at the end when it says his fame spread throughout the region? What is that fame, that akoi, that spreads? So I'm going to begin to explain something that I will continue next week. Is there a messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark? And I would answer, no, it's not a messianic secret. It's the recognition of Jesus that people are struggling to know who he is. And as long as they are not in the know, it's best that they do not try to put words on who Jesus is, that they allow Jesus into their lives. They allow Jesus to heal them. Yes, Jesus will do a lot of miracles in this part of the Gospel of Mark. That they will allow themselves to listen to him, much more important. That they will allow the word to penetrate their inner being and transfigure them, transform them into the type of people that can indeed be sons and daughters of God, conforming to the model that Jesus is offering them. So that at the end of our gospel that we read tonight, it says, at once, immediately, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. I would argue that that fame is very ambiguous. People will talk. They will talk and talk. And their talk will constitute an obstacle for Jesus, for they will be coming to Jesus to seek that human authority, that power that he manifests on this first day. They will want miracles, more and more miracles, like fireworks that they watch. But the real question is, will they allow themselves to be transfigured by the word that Jesus is teaching, by the word that will penetrate their hearts and allow them, because they have heard, because they have ears to hear, to see a world in which the kingdom is dawning? It is this ambiguity rather than a messianic secret that is at stake here. For if they talk without knowing Jesus intimately, they will be talking like the demons. You are the Holy One of God, but that keeps people from listening and has them fixated on seeking fireworks, miracles that can be seen. But it is not through our eyes that the kingdom enters, but rather through ears that open up the eyes of our heart so that we can truly see who Jesus is. The last point that I'd like to mention for tonight, before we open up to discussion, is a very important aspect of what the people say when they ask one another, what is this? A new teaching with authority? And I'd like to suggest that what is new here is the authority with which Jesus teaches. In fact, I would say Jesus has not come to teach something new. The teaching has already been given in the Old Testament. The newness of Jesus is not what he teaches, but what he is. For Jesus conforms perfectly to the teaching that has already been given. Indeed, this is something we always have difficulty getting our mind around. when we say Jesus has not come to teach something new. When we ask, what is the newness in Jesus' teaching? Many will give all kinds of responses. The one I like the least is love. Jesus comes to teach love, as though the whole of the Old Testament is not based on the teaching of love. Love of God and love of one another is the very heart of the Old Testament. So again, I repeat, Jesus' newness is that he teaches with an authority that radiates from his person, for he lives in complete coherence with the Word of God. And in fact, this is what Pope Benedict explained in his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is love, an encyclical published in the same year that he became Pope in 2005. And I quote from that very, very powerful encyclical a statement of Benedict about the newness of Christ. And he says, the real novelty of the New Testament lies not so much in new ideas as in the figure of Christ himself, who gives flesh and blood to those concepts, an unprecedented realism. Indeed, the Old Testament, and in a very special way, the Torah, the books of teaching that we call in Christian tradition, the books of the law, provide for us a word that should govern our lives. It is that word that is perfectly incarnated in Christ. Again, the real novelty of Christ is the incarnation. As John will later put it, the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us to show us what it means to live the Word of God. As we end tonight, let's read one more time the text that we've already read many times, but of course we know that our reading the text and rereading it really brings it into our consciousness as we look for Jesus and try to get to know him better. We want to know him because he is the Word that has become flesh. They, Jesus and his 4 disciples, went to Capernaum, and immediately when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching? With authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Immediately, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. So I'm going to stop share, and we can open up the screen, and we can begin our discussion. And once again, poor Ursula, she'll have to ask all the questions and make all the comments if we don't have any from you.
Well, I'll start off because there's nothing in the chat yet, and I was quite struck by this idea of listening with the heart and how difficult that actually is, even for us today, to not be caught up with the good things and the quick and easy fixes, but to always be looking for, the instant. We live in an instant world, and to really listen with the heart. So that just struck me that was something that Jesus was at that stage already saying. Yeah, well, that you
I'd
can
like to say
still
a
say,
word about
should I
that
say?
because I think that this is a struggle throughout the Old Testament, and that is not to be taken with appearances,
Mm.
not to be taken especially with appearances of power and might. We're in this week, and we know that the basis of this week and what we will celebrate is the Feast of Passover. And it will be a struggle of the people in the wilderness after they've come out of Egypt, not to be taken with the appearance of Pharaoh, to be able to discern between Pharaoh, who they can see, and God, who is a different kind of Pharaoh, who they can only hear, or even more distantly, hear of. And again, it's very, very interesting when Moses goes up the mountain and disappears. Okay, they don't know where he is. What do? They make a symbol of the might of Pharaoh, the golden calf. And their real desire is to go back to a kingdom where might and power are visible. Now, of course, Jesus in Jesus's miracles is showing something to be seen, but we can get caught up in that. And so Jesus will insist in chapter 4 that we must listen. Listen to the parables. The parables are the opposite of fireworks. God held boring. It's daily life. It's the sower going out to sow day after day after day. But it's through listening, allowing that word to penetrate the heart, that our eyes will be opened, the eyes of our heart, so that we can see the dawning of a kingdom where Jesus is our king, our commander. And this is, I think, in the Old Testament, the whole discipline of the wisdom books. So yes, indeed, today we feel we're caught up in this world of publicity, commercials all around us, dragging our eye into places where perhaps we don't even want to go. And the struggle is to listen to the word that should form how we see the world. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's going to be absolutely central as we continue reading through Mark.
A lot of questions have popped in the chat. So let's start with Sean Kraling, who says, how do we understand what an unclean spirit is? How would a first century Jew understand it?
So I think there would be a world of difference between a first century Jew and us. I think that we would have the tendency to psychologize, to kind of turn this into some kind of a psychic disorder, as opposed to some of the physical disorders that Jesus deals with. And of course, Jesus is master of both. But I think that a first century Jew would be aware that when we are not focused on the word, there is the place for the dark side to come into the world, a dark side that really exists, that dwells in the world. Not so much a dark side that comes as a punishment, but a dark side that is there because the world is not yet completely under God's dominion. So I think that a first century Jew would not have any problem realizing that here there is a dominion that is yet to be conquered. And it's a dominion that includes both physical disability and what is being defined here as a kind of state of possession by one of Satan's agents.
Stephen comments, I was thinking of the old Adam in the garden as I watched Jesus chasing out the demon, as if undoing the fault of Adam.
Excellent comment. And of course, it takes us back to our discussion of the baptism and the temptation are presented there as an introductory description of the battle, that Jesus hears the word, "You are my son," and then is led by the Spirit into the wilderness to, in a certain sense, test. Has that word taken root in your being? And will you not allow the voice of Satan to replace the voice of God, as happened to Adam, and as we pointed out as well, as happens at certain moments, important moments in the history of the people of Israel? Jesus is fully son.
Don says, could the new teaching refer to Jesus putting the word into action, as opposed to the Pharisees who were quite aloof and distant from the faithful?
Okay, so for the first part, absolutely. I'd like to say a word about the second part as well, if you permit me, without being nasty. But for the first part, absolutely, yes. If the newness is that Jesus shows us what the word is when it takes on flesh. The word was given for a people, and remember, this is a very peak moment in the life of Israel, chapter 24 of the book of Exodus. Are really a foundational text also for our Eucharistic celebration. But the exemplary people says, and I'll say the words in Hebrew because they're difficult to translate, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will listen, or we will be obedient. In other words, what Jesus is doing is a doing that is completely coherent with the word of God. In other words, by looking at Jesus, we are seeing the Torah in flesh and blood, in activity, in action. So absolutely. I think we must be careful of adding, and of course the Gospels, the Gospel writers, they don't have that caution of saying, not like the Pharisees, because that not like the Pharisees has become, in a certain sense, a teaching of contempt for Jews and for the Jewish struggle to live fidelity to God. So yes, we find those expressions in some of the texts, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, to a certain extent, also in the Gospel of John. But I think we must be careful about echoing too easily those texts, because I think that here Jews, in their own struggle to be faithful, are also struggling to turn the word into flesh and blood in their lives. What we have in particular, and this is the newness of the Christian faith, we have an example of a human being, Jesus, as our brother, flesh and blood, fully living that word become flesh.
I think you've kind of answered this about unclean spirits. Alan asks, how is it that in Jesus' days there was an unclean spirit that was exorcised and spoke, but today we don't see that around us?
I'm not sure that there would be a difference between what Jesus is experiencing and what we might experience. I think that the difference is in the way that we would describe what is happening. I think, again, there is a parallel, a very clear parallel that we'll see as Jesus, this man who has authority, will be dealing with physical disabilities and here spiritual disabilities. I think that we would tend to call them psychological disabilities. So that, again, our work needs to be done in order to recuperate a language that is our own for seeing what's going on in Jesus's time. But again, that's not work that I'm going to be doing here, but there's a lot of material on that. I do not think that the world of Jesus was all that different to our world, both in perceiving the presence of God and perceiving the powers of the kingdom of evil in the world.
Ensley, thank you for a great session. I've never seen the messianic secret in this way. Can one link it with the verse that says, "Be still and know that I am God"? Is Jesus declaring that he is, declaring in this saying that he is God?
So with the last part, I'd agree fully. I would also feel that this is correct to say, be still and know that I am God. I think that what Mark is perhaps proposing in our getting to know Jesus is that we must first be still. We must get to know God before, in fact, we can speak a sensible word about who God is, who Jesus is, and how Jesus works in the world. I think, again, when we are completely captivated by our eyes, seeing what we have just seen. And what have we just seen? A man with an impure spirit being purified and being restored to that man's wholeness. We might too hastily go off and start spreading the akoe, the akoe, translated there, fame, Jesus's fame, what people are saying about him, and that can provide an obstacle to really getting to know Jesus. Getting to know Jesus, and I'll say this with perhaps too much emphasis, does not depend on seeing Jesus do miracles, but does depend on listening closely to what Jesus is saying, to the didache, to the teaching of Jesus that will be presented in a few chapters' time in the parables, that will be presented a second time, and the two texts are very much linked, a second time in the eschatological teaching in chapter 13. So again, we have not all seen miracles, but our faith does not depend on that. What our faith depends on is being nourished by the teaching of Jesus, the word. Again, I draw that parallel between our ears and our eyes. We are led by our eyes far too much, and our ears are left in second place. In the biblical anthropology, this is not a newness of Jesus. This is firmly based on the texts in the Old Testament. It is our ears that must hear. The primary commandment being Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel. And once the word has penetrated, our eyes that have heard can see the kingdom.
Terence asks, does Jesus' communion with the word and law given to humanity by the one God of the Old Testament not suggest we should be seeking community with the people of the Old Testament as much as we seek unity with other Christians?
So, of course, this is a subject dear to my heart. It's come up already once before, where I chose an unfortunate phraseology that was challenged correctly by someone who was listening. Yes, I do believe this is one of the great blessings of our present age, and that is that since the Second Vatican Council, we are really involved deeply in a living dialogue with the Jewish people, a living dialogue that is based upon a shared understanding of the centrality of the word, the centrality of listening. And so I would not say we should rather seek communion with Jews than with other Christians. No, it should all come together. And it's interesting that in the organization of the Catholic Church today, for those who are Catholic, and I'm sure not everyone is here, the dialogue with Christians and the dialogue with the Jewish people are placed under the same organizational rubric, so that really the church is recognizing that there is something in our relationship with the Jewish people that is different from our relationship, and that too should be sought out and valorize our relationship with people of other faith. We have a shared language, and I think that that language is foundationally a language based upon the significance of the word and listening to the word.
Last question. Rebecca asks, what space does human knowledge occupy about God that becomes an abstraction of who Jesus is for the world, for Christ to command it to come out?
Yeah. Again, a very big question to end the session, and I'm not sure we have enough time, but I would say that we don't want to put down our reason. We do not want to put down the human struggle to understand God. That is a very essential part of the gift that God has given us. And again, it goes back to that very significant part of Scripture in the Old Testament and the New called wisdom. We must strive to know God. But of course, at the same time, and here there's a tension, we recognize that knowing God is a gift from God. So we can prepare ourselves for the encounter, but it is God in God's own freedom and grace who comes to encounter us. But perhaps that would be a subject for another day, and especially when we come to chapter 4, where Jesus is a wise sage speaking to us in parables. We'll come back to that question. So I think, Ursula, our time is up. We've even gone 2 minutes over. And this is the time to say thank you very much for joining us, even in Holy Week. And really, we are united in prayer as we go through this very holy time. And we will meet when we can already proclaim that Christ is risen after Easter. Of course, that reality we live in our daily lives. So a blessed Passion Week, a blessed Triduum, and dare I say already, Happy Easter. We will meet next Tuesday. God bless you all.